Welcome to the Bloom Where You're Planted podcast from Never Too Late Cafe. I'm your host, Laura Womack. Each week, we sit down for a chat with someone just like you, someone who had an idea, a passion, a dream, or sometimes just a thought, and planted that seed, watched it grow into something they wanted to share with the world. If you have an idea for a topic or someone that would be a guest for the Bloom Where You're Planted podcast, feel free to reach out to us on Facebook, where you can join our Never Too Late Cafe Facebook group. We'd love to hear from you. So can I take you back a little bit? I know when you said that you were at Harvard. Massachusetts was my home for over 20 years. And whenever I get someone that I can talk to about the area. So you stayed on campus, or did you live in the area?
I lived in Cambridge.
Okay.
In university housing, basically adjacent to the Harvard Yard.
Yes, Harvard. I took some grad school classes, then they were hosted at Longfellow Hall. So I know that. So it was, my school was right in Cambridge, Harvard Square, Cambridge. So anyway.
Well, very, very intense experience, but it's just there's so many cultural riches in
So
Boston,
diverse.
and just Harvard alone. It's an amazing, experience and very rewarding.
I'm sure that helped. Being immersed in that diverse environment definitely helped you on your international path.
Absolutely.
So, okay. So back to Portsmouth, and you were at the college, and I know that you've done some local history projects. Can you share with us a little bit about your local history things that you've worked on?
Yes. Well, this is one of these accidents that happen along the way of living your life. It's that I ended up essentially taking on a whole new career despite myself. This was not planned, and I had no background or expertise in that whatsoever. As you mentioned, I'm not a local or Ohio historian. My field was international, and that's where almost all of my work had been focused on for almost 4 decades. But along the way, when I came back to Portsmouth, which I had been absent from for over 30 years, I came back at about the same time that the Floodwall Mural Project was starting. And of course, the murals were being painted on this massive concrete flood wall that had been built because of the 1937 flood. And there was a sort of a lower wall in 1937. In 1937, the flood of sort of almost Noah proportions in the Ohio River Valley. The flood went 12.74 feet over that lower wall, which had been built to a higher level than the river had ever gotten in recorded history. So in response, built this massive, much taller concrete flood wall that now murals were being painted on. And while I was not born in 1937, my mother and father lived in a cottage on 4th Street, just a few blocks from the university. And at the height of the 37 flood, there was nothing but the chimney sticking out. And they lost everything. this was during the Depression, and this was sort of a common story of not only Portsmouth, but virtually every town up and down the Ohio River from Pittsburgh to Cairo, Illinois, where the Ohio enters the Mississippi. So the water just kept on coming, and people basically said, well, we'll do what we did in the 1913 flood, which was the previous sort of massive flood in Portsmouth. We'll move our furniture up to the second story and sort of wait it out. And when the water goes out, we'll come down and clear out. And as someone in the documentary film that my son and I did on the 1937 flood called River Voices, one of the people that we interviewed for that said, well, it didn't turn out that way. It certainly didn't. The water just kept coming up in the second stories. And so there were thousands, many thousands, some estimates were 10,000 people that had to be rescued from their porch roofs or their second stories. And my father was very much involved with that, because he'd moved my mom and sister at the time, I was just several years old, up with a fellow school teacher. My father was a teacher at Portsmouth High School, as well as a coach, and he moved my mother and sister up to higher ground with a fellow teacher on the hilltop, as it's called. And that teacher happened to have a John boat. And so my father and that teacher sort of went back down into the flood area and started rescuing people off their rooftops and second stories and whatnot. So, which he did for days. And I grew up listening to these stories about going down and rescuing people off out of these houses and rooftops down in the city. And so when I came back to Portsmouth in 1990, and I saw this flood wall, which had been built because of that flood, was being painted on. I said, has anybody, that wall was there because of this flood. Has anybody done any history of the flood? Is there any publication about this? And the answer was basically, well, there's a little bit here and a little bit there and a pamphlet here and whatnot. But basically, there was no sort of comprehensive history. And so I kept saying, well, someone ought to write something or do something on this before the people that went through this are gone, because already I could see that contemporaries of my mother and father were beginning to pass away. And each time that happened, I would say the same thing: is saying, someone ought to capture these stories of these people. And I just never saw myself as doing this because that wasn't my area and field, and I was so heavily involved in now the developments I've talked about earlier at the university in the international realm. But time went on, and more people passed away that were survivors of that flood, and including my father. And I said, finally, well, if nobody else can do anything about this, maybe I should, at least for historical preservation purposes. So I had no intention of writing a book or doing a film or anything on this, other than just sort of capturing stories of survivors of the 1937 flood. So I started interviewing people orally. And I had literally just started on that project and only done several interviews when And then I was going to pass on these interviews to the library, and well, then it would be available for someone down the line to use that as raw material for a more comprehensive history of the flood. I had just started that when our son graduated with a master's degree in film and video production. And at his
perfect timing, right?
Well, yes, the accidents of history, so to speak. So at a reception for his graduation ceremony, I happened to mention to him, I said, I've just started this interviewing people on this little historic preservation project. And, it's really kind of conducive to capturing this on film and video. I wonder if you would like to sort of join me and, let's just get these on, on film and donate them to the university. Well, I fully expected him to say, get serious and not be the least bit interested. I mean, part of the issue was that he lived in Washington, D.C., and I'm here, and how were we going to do it, even if we did it? But much to my surprise, he said, why not? And now suddenly the ball was in my court.
Filmmaker kind of made sense, right?
You're right. But at that point, I was really, start scrambling and trying to figure out, okay, how do I make this, happen? And the bottom line is that I ended up writing a little grant proposal to the Ohio Humanities Council, and got a planning grant to start doing some filming on the 1937 flood story in Portsmouth, Ohio. And that was a fairly small grant that was intended for planning purposes. And they told me that, because they do have production grants as well, but they told me that, well, your chances of getting a production grant are 1%. And that we rarely give production grants. So I took that as a challenge, and I told my son that, well, look, you can talk about film all you want, but what really counts is what you show. So with this planning grant, we can't do too much. I mean, after I had to, pay his expenses coming from Washington, and they had a lot of other sort of expenses involved with the film production. So I knew we couldn't do much with the planning grant, but I told my son, well, I'm going to put my own money into this, and we're going to produce a demo piece which will knock their socks off and sell itself. And that's what I did. We worked quite diligently. I poured quite a bit of my own money into this to get this going. And we ended up getting a production grant from the Ohio Humanities Council that was run through the university, and allowed us to produce the documentary film called River Voices. The subtitle is A Portrait of an American River Community. And one of the things that we tried to do in this film, and apparently succeeded given its subsequent history, was to tell the story of the 1937 flood in Portsmouth, Ohio, through the voices of the people that actually went through the flood. So we interviewed a great many people, many of who at that time were in their 70s, 80s, 90s. We interviewed one lady who was 101 years old.
Oh, wow.
At the time, and still quite cogent and coherent, and gave us a terrific interview. And that was Rose Jacobs, who I think a lot of people would be familiar with as a sort of a local icon. In any event, we then we would match up what people told us in firsthand, and then match that with photographic or film footage, sort of illustrating, what they were talking about, or the point that was being made. So we did this in what sometimes is referred to as the Ken Burns technique. If any of your listeners are aware of his documentary films, like what he did with Civil War, for instance. Again, sort of matching up narrative and or with baseball or jazz and other films he's done. Sort of matching up now interviews or voice or narrative with pictures and visual, evidence to weave a story and tell a story. So that's what we did. And again, it's not talking heads. You see who's talking every once in a while for identification purposes, but essentially what you're hearing, sort of the voices of people, and then it's matched up with images. So we produced that film, and there was a great deal of interest in that from the very beginning. When we started interviewing people, we noticed how many people seemed to really be interested in this. As the kind of the story spread that we were doing this film, I had a lot of people interview me about this, and for newspaper or radio, and we were aware that there was a good deal of interest in this. So we had a premiere of this in October 2002. At the time, I was still active in university matters, so I was doing this on top of what my regular job was. And son was doing the same thing, as he had another job in Washington, D.C. So it wasn't easy with the distance, and both of us working full time. But we ended up producing this film, and at the time, we thought of this as sort of a one-shot affair. I was, doing this partially, again because of the experience with my own parents, and I pretty much conceived of it as a one-shot affair. And we used to sort of say at the time, there'll be some interest in this film when it comes out for a little while, and after a few months it'll die down, and then we will get our lives back. Well, that was in fall of 2002. And here it is, 2022, and we haven't gotten our lives back, because our lives have been taken over in many ways by being film producers and creators, and particularly myself. My son still has another job, and we're still having to do this by long distance. But we have now subsequently gone on and done other films, and are working on one at the present.
So you did win an award. You did show this film outside of the region, and I think we talked about you won some very prestigious award at a film festival.
Yes, there's been quite a journey here. Let me go back to how this all sort of started. It was with the premiere of River Voices in 2002, in which we held the premiere in the Vern Reif Performing Arts Center at the university, which holds approximately 1,200 people. And actually, that was the goal of my son and I, were to fill that auditorium, which is not that that easy in a town of 21, 22,000 to fill 1,200 seats. And we would have sort of died and gone wherever we're going, happy if that had happened, and then nothing else happened. I mean, we had no plans for the future in regard to film at that point in time. But we get to the premiere, and lo and behold, I mean, it was just amazing what happened. It was a ticketed event. The tickets were free, and it was advertised in the newspaper and on radio and through Shawnee State outlets. And people could come into the box office and get 4 tickets per family. And we also put a coupon in the paper in which you could mail in and get the tickets sent to you by mail. And lo and behold, 10 days before the premiere, all the tickets were gone. And people kept coming. Yeah. And people kept coming into the box office and wanting tickets. There weren't any. These coupons kept coming in from the newspaper, and there weren't any. We had 267 requests for tickets beyond being sold out. And so we had taken people's names, and so we ended up putting on an encore presentation 2 days later. That was a Monday evening in the Flora Lecture Hall in the university, which holds with the open wings approximately 400 people. And we thought, well, that will be plenty, because there's 267 people that want to come for the premiere in the Performing Arts Center. So, and how many of those are going to come, a couple of days later on a Monday? And we figured, oh, well, that's plenty of space. So there shouldn't be a problem there. And we didn't have much time to advertise it, so we advertised that there was going to be this encore. Lo and behold, that Monday evening, 20 minutes before it was scheduled to be shown, every seat was taken, and there were people standing outside wanting to get in. And it was. It was incredible. We brought every chair we could find to fill in every space we could. It's a good thing the fire marshal wasn't there. We'd been shut down because we violated every fire.
I was like, there goes the fire code.
Yeah, right, exactly. And in the end, there wasn't a square inch of space to put any other chairs any place. And there were still a dozen people. Who I basically had to say, well, the only choice is to sort of stand back against the back wall there, and it's an hour-long film, so it's a long time to stand. But I'm sorry, that's the only choice. And lo and behold, they all stayed, and there we were in this jam-packed into this lecture hall for the encore. Well, that's when, for the premiere and the encore, that's when we became aware that, wow, I mean, we've got hold of something here. Because one of the things I asked people at the encore was, how did you hear about this? And most people said, well, we heard about it from someone who came to the premiere and said, you got to see this, got to see this film. And that's when I really learned the power of the word of mouth.
Mm.
So what happened was that sort of word got out around this, and I ended up being contacted about this being shown on television. And one thing led to another. There was an intervening step here in which our film came out about the same time as the Ohio Bicentennial celebration was beginning, and which was the year of 2013, or sorry, 2003. And there were a myriad of activities sponsored by organizations all over the state to do something special for that premiere. For the celebration, including sort of the painting of barns in each county, and just a whole variety of celebrations and activities.
Oh, the
One of the
quilts. The
yes, the
quilts on the
quilts,
barns.
yeah, yes, exactly. And so one of those was sponsored by the Historical Society of Ohio, and it was a sort of a competition for choosing the best public presentation of Ohio history. And that was a pretty broad definition. So it included anything that could be considered a public presentation, including like outdoor dramas like Tecumseh and all these other, there's a whole good number of these things around the state, and books and exhibits and films and just anything that could fall into that rubric. And we were nominated. And there were hundreds and hundreds of nominations for this. And so I was asked to put together a packet, which I did. And we thought, well, there's chances are close to zero on sort of winning this, and but lo and behold, we ended up winning first place, and that was a big deal.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it truly was. I was astounded at the time, and even when I recall it now, it still astounds me. In any event, we then got calls and contacts from all sorts of news outlets around the state, all the major newspapers, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the Columbus Dispatch, all the major papers. Picked up on this story and wanted to talk to me, and various other publications. Ohio Magazine, for instance, did a spread on us. And that magazine at the time had a circulation of 250,000. And then I was asked to come and show the film and speak to communities, which actually for the next few years, I was very heavily involved with, going to community after community, practically every community up and down the Ohio River in Ohio. A local organization, a library, a historical society, or genealogical society. I mean, you name it. I mean, there were just so many different organizations that had heard about the film, especially amongst the river community. So it's wanted me to come and show it locally and talk about the making of it. So I spent several years, basically doing lecture tours on the 37 flood.
Well, anyone that lived during that time, that's a very historic time. It's like a time stamp for their lives where they would say, back in the Depression or during the 37 flood, it's just a marker so much for the people that lived, especially during that time, and the children and grandchildren to hear about that. So,
And yes, you're absolutely right. It truly was a time marker. So what began to happen then was, as I mentioned, my son and I were thinking at the time that, well, this is one and done. And then, we go back to what we were doing before. But because of all this sort of activity, including, I should mention that WOSU TV in Columbus, a PBS station, sort of the flagship station of Ohio, was wanted to premiere this on television, and so we worked out an arrangement with them. And they did, and they did us actually a great favor, in my opinion, being that they ended up, well, number one, they actually put us on the cover of their programming guide for the month, so it was featured, and they scheduled the premiere for 8 o'clock Sunday evening, which was just prior to Downton Abbey at 9 o'clock. And this is at a time when Downton Abbey was the most popular program going. So there was a huge viewership for that. And here we were on right before that. So I'm sure we got a kick from that, but it turned out that we got just outstanding, viewership. So we they were obviously delighted, and ended up then signing a contract with us for viewing rights, or airing rights for a number of years, and they ended up airing River Voices over the years. I think I've counted up at one point in time like 38 times, in all sorts of different time slots, including a number of again, prime time slots. So we got a lot of exposure through that, which actually then led, because there was this continuing popularity of this, and we were able to gauge this because as the sort of the PBS way or method here, when they showed like a documentary, there'll be something at the end of the program saying, if you'd like a copy of this video, then we'll call this 1-800 number. Well, the 800 number was WOSU. Each of these individual stations that show this, they have this arrangement. They take care of, and that was a part of what we had now agreed to with them, was we provided them boxes of videos, and then people would call in after a program, and then they would take care of fulfilling that. And they also would take a very large sort of share of the proceeds on that, which was fine with us because we were supporting PBS, and we weren't in this for the money. So it was just great to have that kind of exposure and get the story out, so to speak. So that's that just kept going on and on. And so they ask if, maybe we could sponsor this and try to, have it go national on PBS, which of course we agreed to, and one thing led to another, and that happened. And it happened to a later film of ours also, on the floodwall murals, called Beyond These Walls, which is really about the subtitle, Building Community Through Public Art. So both River Voices and then Beyond These Walls ended up not only premiering on TV on WSU TV, but also airing nationally on PBS. In the meantime, all this activity had brought us to the attention of a much wider audience, and I started to, getting calls and contacts, people that for multiple reasons, but one of those was not only talking about our film and filmmaking, but also people contacting us, wanting us to hire us to do film. And my son and I decided at the time that, well, look, we're not in this for the business or really to sort of make money, and we really do enjoy and had a wonderful experience working together, or as my son says, because the number one question that he is asked is, what's it like to work with your old man? And he has this wonderful stock answer, which sums it up beautifully, in which he says, it's a real bonding experience, which he says in kind of a sarcastic tone of voice, and people crack up. But that really does sum it up. Truly,
it has to be, because you've worked on these major projects together. So
yes, absolutely. And and I can see, as we've now worked together on film for almost a quarter of a century, almost 25 years now since we first started with River Voices, and we're still going and going strong. So what one of the things I discovered in this process is I can see clearly why partnerships fall apart. It's when ego gets involved, so what has occurred in our case is that for us it's kind of like a dialectic in which people assume it's a senior junior partnership, but really it's not. We're very much kind of on equal footing, so to speak, and we have very different approaches to things, so we actually have our differences of opinion and view in terms of as this process, this creative process of bringing his film into being occurs over time. And sort of what happens is that we have this sort of clash of views on things, and then out of that comes a synthesis, which is neither this nor that, but is something creative and new. And that whole process is it's just a sort of a growing and creative process, which I really find it's very dynamic, and it's also very fulfilling. There are so many times that I've sat and sort of watched in these presentations I give and whatnot, our films, and I'll look at something on the screen and I'll say, that's pretty good, but I know how we got to that point, and it's not the way I would have done it. Exactly. It's something that came out of this dialectic, and that's really an extremely sort of rewarding experience, and that's kind of been what's happened with us as filmmakers. Along this path, and there's again, it's a creative process, and anything that comes out of a creative process, as I'm sure any artist can tell you, or writer, or anybody that's doing anything creative in any field whatsoever. And that's really kind of where the reward is, the struggle to come up with something that's new and different, and you go through this process, um, uh, which is it's not all pleasurable. There's a lot of I guess you could call it pain involved. Uh, uh,
With the
but
meeting of the minds and different ideas on how things should go. And
right, exactly. But in the end, if you sort of stay the path, and then that's an important part of this creative process, in my opinion, which I'll be happy to address if you'd like. We can come back to that. But in any event, that's kind of what happened to us in our taking on whole new careers despite ourselves as filmmakers, because we decided at that point in time to pick up the narrative again that, uh, well, I mean, and people were actually offering us money to do films, but the problem was is that they wanted something to show their organization or themselves or whatever, and the bright light, and in other words, they wanted some input or control in the editing process, and we basically said no, we're not willing to do that, even though we could get paid well for it. We would prefer to have 100% creative control. And if someone's willing to help support that, and in a project that we find of interest to ourselves, then fine, we'll be open. And that's what happened. Again, I pretty much expected at the time that, there's probably not going to be anybody wanting to take us up on that, but there was, and that's what led to our second big film. We did some other projects as well, and we self-funded and were of interest to us. For instance, we traveled to Rwanda and did some filming and ended up producing a piece relating to Rwanda, and kind of a part of the sort of genocide story in Rwanda, which was quite an emotional task, actually, and in several other pieces, but smaller pieces. But the big next piece was really the floodwall mural project, which was funded primarily through Portsmouth Murals Inc. And we did a film on the murals entitled "Beyond These Walls: Building Community Through Public Art." And that film ended up essentially following the same path that I'd previously described with River Voices. It just took off. It took off much faster than River Voices, because by that time we were a known entity. And so that also had a very successful run, still very much alive, as is River Voices, through our websites and through our production company. We have a LLC production company called Lorentz Productions, and for anybody that might be interested, you can just Google that, Lorentz Productions, and that has links to our websites, which we have for both River Voices and for Beyond These Walls. Or you can Google the names of the films and go to those websites. Both of these films are still very much alive. Years after the premiere, in the case of River Voices, 20 years after. And the question arises all the time is, how do you account for that? I mean, most films sort of come and then, there's interest in for a while, and then they sort of, die out. It's kind of like, social media threads. And I thought about that a lot. And what I've come up with is that what we really sort of tried to do, and have apparently succeeded somewhat, is to tell a story. And in this case, we took something that was really, most people would consider quite local. The story of Portsmouth, Ohio in 1937, the flood. The story of now taking, as one says in our film, a concrete monstrosity and turning it into this thing of beauty that attracts people. So it's the story of those, but it's also a universal story. It's my conviction as a historian that all individual history and all community history, or national history for that matter, is really universal. Our individual experience, even if the story is told in the right way, it connects with all other individuals because we're all human beings. We all have the same emotions and same feelings and same basic machinery, so to speak, that if you can connect to others. So this idea of connection is very important to me. And so an idea of sort of a sense of community. And if there is any single thread or theme that runs through our film work, that would probably be it. A sense of community and the significance and importance of that. Yes, a connection, right, and creating and maintaining that sense of community and what that sort of impact it has. So we pretty much had this in mind, although we didn't sort of explicitly in the beginning sort of set out. It just sort of emerged and became more and more important in terms of the way we view things and try to document things. So in the case of the 1937 flood, even though it's a story of Portsmouth, it's really a universal story in that what we tried to tell was how individuals and communities cope with natural disaster. And anybody can relate to that.
Absolutely.
In fact, one of the kind of sort of fallout, so to speak, from that is that people, every time there is a major natural disaster, flood, natural disaster, there's a big uptake in interest in our film. Like, there's the Red River flood up in the upper Midwest, the Katrina in particular, but other sort of major floods.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it is, because I think what happens is that when that kind of happens, then people go to sort of search on websites or search, on the web for, information on floods and whatnot. They end up coming across our website and then end up contacting us, or a number of people do. And then there's kind of an uptick in sales, for instance, whenever that occurs. So it's been a very interesting road that we've been on here. And,
after all these years, you still have interest. I never would have thought.
We do, and in a sense, it'll never go out of date, so to speak, because natural disasters and floods are going to continue to happen indefinitely. So, and then beyond these walls, the same kind of thing sort of occurred. And I didn't fully even recognize this until, after the fact, when people started contacting me from all over the country when this aired nationally on PBS. In which I got calls from Alaska, from Florida, Maine, California, all over the country. I got calls from people from many different walks of life, not just people interested in art or mural art, but people from, like, I got calls from city planners and developers, people involved in development of some sort in cities, lawyer, call from a lawyer, from head of a art museum, head of a historical society, and on it went. I mean, there was just teachers educating people in education, of course. And on it went. There was just a very wide sort of variety of people, and it became clear inevitably what the appeal of this was, and that every community in one way or another is trying to revitalize itself. And
very interesting point. Yes.
Yeah. And that's really, in a sense, what our film illustrates or is about. It's about taking a local asset. It's hard to think of this ugly concrete wall as being an asset, but in a sense, it was or is. It certainly is now. And how did that come about? It came about because you had a small group of people who thought creatively and innovatively, and basically asked themselves, what can we do to transform this concrete monstrosity into something that is an asset to the community? And they did it. Well, that's the story. That's the subtitle, Building Community Through Public Art. And that's a story we tried to tell. So it's not only a film about, sort of the history of this, how it came into being, how this art is created on concrete. It's all that, and and more. But the primary point of the whole film is this building community through public art, and what that has meant for the community of Portsmouth. You think of it, as of a year or so ago, I saw a report from the Ohio Department of Public Transportation that the flood wall murals in Portsmouth were the #1 tourist attraction in the state of Ohio at that time.
Oh, amazing. Hey, John.
Absolutely amazing.
I'm going to have to do another part, and I want us to look at our schedules because there is so much more that we need to talk about. Thanks for joining us this week for the second part of our chat with Dr. John Lorentz. Be sure to check every Wednesday for new episodes of the Bloom Where You're Planted podcast.